name is Kathy Janelle, and I teach high school biology for Knox County Schools, and I teach at Farragut Middle School. Today you're going to be working on the Science Biology Activity 4 for summer content. All activities and handouts can be found under the Student Resources tab on the Knox County Schools website. And we'd love for you to show us what you've learned and tweet it out on KCS Science. If this video is hard to understand, please turn on your closed captions if they're available, adjust the playback speed to slow down the video, consider watching short clips, then pause, listen, and watch again, or ask someone in your home to watch the video with you. Stop frequently and talk to your partner about what you heard and what you understood. The format for the lesson is that sometimes we will pause the video to complete questions, watch a separate video, or follow a Quizlet link. Look for the image below to know when to pause the video. You will need the KCS at-home student resources, the handout that is, and colored pencils or markers in blue, green, red, and orange. You will also need some coins, bingo chips, a few coasters, or other small items to count. You'll need approximately 75 of the coins and perhaps about 4 coaster-sized objects. So I suggest pausing the video now and making sure you have those resources available. So reviewing back to activity 3, in that activity you learned about population dynamics. And one of the topics you may have also spent some time on is coral bleaching. And in that idea, we consider how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. And as carbon dioxide levels have increased in our atmosphere, that carbon dioxide becomes dissolved in our oceans. The carbon dioxide dissolving in the ocean water actually increases or decreases the acidity. So we have a more acidic environment, and we have coral bleaching or death of corals occur. That's a great segue for where we're headed in this activity on the carbon cycle. So what will we learn about today? How does the carbon cycle move through living and non-living parts of our ecosystem? How can humans affect the carbon cycle? Those are the 2 things we'll be learning about in this lesson. So first I want to know, what do you already know? I'd like you to follow the Quizlet link on the KCS at-home resources and practice your vocabulary before you begin. Let's see what you know from 7th grade and also 8th grade, leading up to getting you into biology. Now that you've had a chance to practice your vocabulary on Quizlet, let's look at how the processes intertwine. Specifically, there were 4 processes that you looked at on your Quizlet: biological, geological, physical and chemical, and then also human activities that affect the carbon cycle. We're going to zero in on those specifically at this point in time. So following along on your student resources page, I'm now on number 2 within that. Your diagram looks like mine on the screen. You can see we have atmospheric carbon, forests showing vegetation, fossil fuels, we have dissolved oxygen and carbon dioxide, I should say, in our water, and then we have things like carbonate rocks and also plant material in the water. The first thing I'd like you to do is take your blue colored pencil, and we're going to illustrate the biological processes. I'd like you to draw 2 blue arrows to show the cycling of carbon dioxide. Please show that cycling on both the vegetation side into the atmosphere and from animals as well, and also that cycling that's happening in the water. Remember, as plants and animals are performing cellular respiration to produce ATP energy for their cells, they are emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Remember as well that plants are performing photosynthesis that are using carbon dioxide in that process. Now let's get your green colored pencil and draw 2 arrows that show the cycling of carbon dioxide. So in this instance, we're looking to see how some carbon dioxide, actually as we look at the process of decomposition, can eventually become fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. At the same time, we can show how we have carbon dioxide cycling back into our atmosphere through the carbon in marine sediments and carbonate rocks. Next, I'd like you to get your red color pencil and show the cycling of carbon dioxide through the physical and chemical processes. And lastly, with your orange color pencil, please draw 2 orange arrows to show the cycling of carbon dioxide from human impact. So in this case, the burning of fossil fuels is causing atmospheric carbon to rise, and also looking at removing forested areas is also causing carbon dioxide increased. Now that you've drawn your cycles, you have a complete picture of the 4 processes and their impact on the carbon cycle. So let's brainstorm. Where is carbon stored on Earth? We've looked to see how the carbon's actually cycling, but where is the carbon otherwise found? Is there different amounts of carbon that's found in these places? And what forms of carbon are found on Earth? Following along on your student handout, we're now on number 3. The atmosphere is a place where we have carbon stored as a gas, carbon dioxide. The ground is a place where we have carbon stored in fossil fuels. And remember that living things are also a place where we store carbon in the form of macromolecules. If you think back to your earlier modules in biology, you learned about the 4 macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So those are all places where carbon is stored on a basic level. So I want you to think about this. Have you heard of a project called Pleistocene Park? This is happening in Siberia right now. And I'd like you to click on the link at the KCS at-home student resources and watch the short video that shows you what's going on in Siberia with creating something called Pleistocene Park. So pause the video, watch that, and then I'll see you on the other side. So what did you think? What did you think about taking Siberia and returning it to the Pleistocene area? Removing forests, trying to increase permafrost. It seems like a really far off reality, but there's a lot of science behind that possibility. So how does carbon actually cycle through the ecosystem, and how would something like Pleistocene Park even be really relevant? So we think about carbon as moving through pools or reservoirs. Every time carbon moves, we call this a flux. So here's an image that you've seen already. You've created this image on your handout with your colored pencils, but now notice I've added some rectangles and squares that show the actual flux. So let's zero in, for example, on the blue arrows. It says that carbon dioxide is taken up by producers during photosynthesis and released by cellular respiration. And those consumers eat producers and release carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. So those are happening both on the land or terrestrial environments and also aquatic environments. So you can pause for a second and take a look at those fluxes if you need more time. So how big are all of these pools of carbon though? If we had to put a measure on that, it's hard to imagine how much that is. And in fact, we're going to use a source of measurement that's probably very different to you, and that's a gigaton. So let's stop and think about how much is a gigaton. So if I had to think about how many vehicles weigh a gigaton, it would take about 500 million vehicles to be the equivalent of 1 gigaton. If you've ever been to the Statue of Liberty before in New York, it's a huge monolith that you can't miss as you're heading into Manhattan. There are about 4.4 million statues that you'd need to have to be the equivalent of 1 gigaton. If you've been to Niagara Falls and seen the water pouring over those falls at such a fast rate, you'd need to stand and watch for 98 consecutive hours to have the equivalent of water going over those falls to be that of 1 gigaton. So as we start to look about the size of the carbon pools and we measure in gigatons, keep that in your brain about how large of a unit and scale we're really thinking about. So how much carbon's really in those pools? Even if we measure with gigatons, what is that really looking like? So here's how we're going to do that. And I'm on step 7 on your handout. You're going to be considering the coins representing 100 gigatons of carbon. Each coaster or other item you had that was perhaps about that size represents 10,000 gigatons of carbon. I'd like you on your paper to complete the chart to represent the circles and coasters or coins and coasters for each carbon pool. Stack those on your sheet on the following page or page 3 of your handout, and I'd like you to round them to your nearest hundred. So for example, if I had 620 gigatons, I'd round down to 600 and stack six coins to be representative of that. So pause the video now, finish your chart under 7B, and then we're going to look at the answers before you actually go to create your model. So on your answers, here's where I have my scale made to match the amount of carbon in each of these carbon pools. Notice that when I got to the deep ocean, considering there was 38,000 gigatons of carbon there, I switched and used coasters, or 4 of them, to be representative of that amount. If you wanted to use coins and you had a lot in your home, you could do that. You would need the equivalent of 380 coins to represent that according to our scale. And you probably don't have that much available. So let's look at the model. This is on the following page of your student handout. Notice that we have things like sedimentary rock, fossil fuel reserves, soil, and vegetation representing our terrestrial component or land component. We have the atmosphere above, and then in our ocean component, we have the upper ocean and marine life, the deep ocean, and the ocean floor surface sediment. So we have 2 different types of the earth that we're looking at in terms of land and water, and then the atmosphere above. I'd like you to pause now and use your coins, chips, whatever you have accumulated in your home, and create a model by stacking those to match the equivalency of what we've just created on our table. So when I created my model, it looks like this. Notice that I used white chips to represent the deep ocean. I had to alter my scale slightly, but even when I look at that, what do you start to notice about the quantity of chips in each of those pools? Was anything surprising to you? When I look at that stack by the deep ocean, it surprises me how tall that is. In fact, I can start to see a shadow of the chips that are overcast on the other chips below. Was that really what I expected to happen? I want you to think about those questions yourself. On your student page, in questions 8, 9, and 10, I'd like you to name one carbon pool that surprised you the most and why. Where is most of the carbon stored on Earth according to your model? And why is most of that carbon stored in that carbon pool? In other words, why do you think there's so much carbon in the highest carbon pool on Earth? So pause the video now and take a few moments to go through and construct your explanation for 8, 9, and 10. So now that you've had a chance to write down your thoughts, let's talk about what you may have thought about. Okay, when I've done this with students before, a lot of my students are oftentimes surprised at the amount of carbon that's stored in the ocean. I was surprised too, considering how tall that stack of chips became. I also hear students oftentimes saying that they're surprised at how little carbon is stored in the atmosphere as compared to the rest of the carbon on Earth. And if you think about it, we hear a lot about carbon and the amount of carbon in our atmosphere being troubling. So we'll come back to that thought in a moment because that's a very real observation. Is there anything else that surprised you? Most of the carbon in number 9 that's stored on Earth we find in the deep ocean. And that's really surprising to most people, as we already talked about before. So why do we think there's so much carbon stored in that pool? Well, let's think about when we scale in proportionality of land and water on Earth. As you've learned before in social studies classes that led you up to this grade level, most of the Earth is covered in water in the ocean. And so when you think about it, the scale or the sheer volume of water on Earth is much greater than the terrestrial Earth, meaning we have more of the Earth covered in water than land. And as a result, that's why we have so much carbon stored in there. It's also really important to recognize that a close runner-up was looking at the soil and the fossil fuel reserves. Does that remind you of anything from earlier this lesson when we consider soil holding a lot of carbon? When I think about it, it reminds me of Pleistocene Park and the work that Zimov is starting to do in Siberia. By changing the permafrost and increasing the coolness of it, meaning to make it even more frozen or areas that are not frozen, frozen again, perhaps we can capture more carbon and store it in the soil. Let's go back to that thought about the atmosphere too, because while we do hear about it a lot, it did not show up as a big pool of carbon. But let's remember what type of carbon is stored in our atmosphere, and that's carbon dioxide and methane. And those forms of carbon gas are really instrumental in keeping the Earth warm. It creates a blanket, an insulating layer. Now, as that blanket gets thicker and more carbon is stored in the atmosphere, that can affect global warming and global temperatures. So that's a really important part to remember as we consider this idea of carbon cycle. So what do those arrows mean on the diagram? Letters A through I that are moving back and forth. Can you think of what we've talked about today already that might be representative of those arrows? If you're thinking flux, you're exactly right. We're looking at carbon moving from one pool to the next, from one reservoir to the next. The movement of the carbon from one sink to another. And I'd like you to pause the video now and label each of those fluxes from photosynthesis and respiration, combustion, the burning of biomass or of living material, weathering and erosion, diffusion and photosynthesis, diffusion and respiration, ocean mixing and sedimentation, combustion of fossil fuels, and volcanism. Label your diagram and then look at that movement itself. So pause the video now and label your diagram. The last thing I'd like to talk about with you is how humans affect the carbon movement. We've already touched about this a little bit when we consider the carbon sinks and pools and the flux of movement of that, but let's talk specifically about human activities and how that changes the flux. And so on your paper, we're going to start looking at number 12. So how do scientists do this? How can they measure this impact? Well, we know that carbon dioxide is emitted year-round because plants and animals, living things, are always doing respiration. They always have to make ATP for their cells, and they're always dying and going through decomposition. So that carbon released into our atmosphere is a constant. But what we also know is that photosynthesis is a time when carbon dioxide is removed from our atmosphere, but that's primarily happening in the spring and summer seasons. So if we were a scientist looking at this emission of carbon dioxide gas, and we were living in the northern hemisphere, we would expect to see more carbon dioxide removed through the process of photosynthesis in spring and summer, say from April on through September. But if we were living in the southern hemisphere, thinking back to what you've learned about Earth seasons in earlier grades, in that case we'd be looking for more carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere during photosynthesis, say from the months of November on through March. So bear that in mind about how carbon dioxide changes in emission and removal throughout the year based on seasons. So the human impact. Let's think about deforestation. This example has to do with the Amazon, but frankly, that happens around the world. When humans cut down trees and burn them, the carbon that was stored in the trees is released. So how does that impact the flux or movement of carbon? The way I would think about this, and my answer would be, I'm moving the carbon from vegetation to the atmosphere. So pause the video now, and I'd like you to consider the remaining 6 activities that humans can perform and how that would impact the environment and the carbon cycle. Now that you've had a chance to answer on your own, let's look at planting trees, for example. As plants grow, they take in more carbon dioxide and perform photosynthesis. Now, some of you may also make the argument about cellular respiration then increasing, which is true, but we need to really be mindful of what we're discussing here about the removal of carbon dioxide instead. So in that case, my answer would be the atmosphere and soil to the vegetation. My answer for burning fossil fuels in automobiles was that we're taking fossil fuel carbon and moving it into the atmospheric carbon. My answer for increasing cement manufacturing, not only for dams, but for other structures. In this case, I'm looking at the rock carbon pool moving to the atmosphere carbon pool. This one's really kind of interesting, I think, is that sometimes power plants can actually capture some of the carbon and they can inject it into the ground and they can restore that carbon. So what do you think about this one? It seems almost lateral. And I thought the same thing. I said it could be fossil fuel to fossil fuel, or you could make the argument that we're going from the atmosphere into fossil fuel. So that's probably a positive outcome. When we burn fossil fuels for electricity, in that case, we're looking at fossil fuel to the atmosphere. And when you think about the building of homes and businesses and roadways, not so much the structures themselves, but that causes a decrease in vegetation, which then causes an increase in weathering and erosion. So what I thought was soil would then have increased erosion, and that would cause more carbon to move from that pool to the upper ocean, eventually by runoff. So it's time to show what you know. Complete the Quizlet on the KCS at-home resources to demonstrate your mastery of this concept. Pause the video and do that component. Now that you've shown that you've mastered this activity, congratulations. Let's go back to Siberia, and I want to leave you with something to consider. Should Zimov continue to build Pleistocene Park? Is this a positive or a negative human impact on the carbon cycle? You have some opportunities to keep researching. On your student resources page, I've given you the link to Pleistocene Park's website so you can learn more about his mission and how Pleistocene Park appears at this time. I'd also like to give you a link for a counter-argument on the woolly mammoth. As you've learned through your readings in the video, there are some major labs in the United States who are considering using genetic research to bring back some extinct organisms such as the woolly mammoth. Remember, the benefit that Zimov saw to this was that they were large grass eaters and they also allowed compaction and removal of large trees so that grasslands can continue to grow. Is this a good thing? You have a place on your work in order to write a claim, evidence, reasoning statement about your ideas. What do you think should happen based on the knowledge you have today from the carbon cycle? That's it for me here for Activity 4. I've really appreciated my time with you, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. I would love to see the models and other thoughts that you have about this activity, and show us what you've learned at KCS Science.